Have you noticed that beer tastes different than it did a few years ago? And it's not always a recipe change. Sometimes it's the part nobody looks at, the date code you can't find, the warm shelf you didn't notice, the brand that got bought but kept the same voice on the can. So let me ask you this. What if the real skill in the beer aisle isn't picking the best brand? It's spotting which ones are safest to buy right now, in this store, under these conditions. I'm counting down 8 California beer brands you must avoid buying blind in grocery stores. And the first one is the easiest to miss, because it still looks exactly like a local favorite, with those sunset colors showing up in almost every supermarket. Number 8, Golden Road Brewing. On a busy grocery run, the bright cans with layered colors practically reach out first. They look relaxed, local, and a little like someone turned a backyard party into packaging. The story those designs sell is that you are grabbing something born right down the road, made by people who are still scrappy and close to the community. The promise here is simple: fun, easy drinking, and a feeling that you are supporting something rooted in this state's culture. The reality is that Golden Road Brewing has been part of a global beer company for years, which means the local craft story is mostly about branding. One receipt is the ownership change itself, widely discussed when it happened, because it was positioned as a craft brand, joining a much larger portfolio. Another receipt is what you can trace through packaging language and corporate family of brands positioning, where the tone stays casual, while the structure behind it is clearly not a small neighborhood operation. Then there is the shelf-level receipt that does not require any digging. This label is everywhere: stadiums, chain restaurants, huge events, every major grocery cooler. That kind of saturation is not proof of wrongdoing, but it is a strong signal about scale, distribution power, and priorities that go beyond small local craft. The consequence for you is not that the beer is unsafe. It is that you pay a little extra, believing you are voting for independent California craft, when you are actually reinforcing the same big system many people say they want to escape. Action tip: if a label leans hard on local imagery but appears in every massive national venue, assume it is not truly independent and decide if that still fits your goal before it hits your cart. And if you think that is the only label with a rebel voice and a corporate backbone, the next brand takes that tension up a notch. Number 7, Lagunitas Brewing Company. In a lot of coolers, there is one familiar India Pale Ale that friends suggest when they want something safe. It feels like an old friend, a little hoppy, a little bold, and stamped with a personality that reads anti-corporate and laid back. For many people, this is the beer they discovered when they first stepped out of the basic lager world, and that nostalgia is strong. The promise is that you are still grabbing an outsider, a local character that somehow survived all the changes in beer. The reality is that Lagunitas Brewing Company sold a major stake and eventually went fully into the hands of a giant international brewer, even while the tone of the label stayed almost exactly the same. Receipt 1 is the publicly discussed deal structure that moved the brand from independent to global ownership while keeping the brand voice intact. Receipt 2 is the distribution footprint you can see with your own eyes. Bottles and cans showing up in far more countries and chain locations than a truly independent California brewer could typically reach without major outside infrastructure. There is also a taste world receipt that people argue about, which is exactly why it belongs here. Some fans say the core beer still tastes close to what it used to. Others say it has slid toward the middle, less sharp, less expressive, more safe. That is not a courtroom fact. It is a pattern of consumer reporting that shows up again and again when brands scale and broaden their audience. The consequence is that the word craft starts to mean a vibe more than a business reality, and that is where shoppers quietly overpay. So buy it like you would buy any widely distributed label. Assume the voice on the can is marketing, not a promise. And only spend the premium if you are fine with what is actually behind it. And if you want a cleaner test, look at what happens when a brand builds its entire identity on being uncompromising, then has to survive inside a much bigger machine. Number 6, Stone Brewing. Walk into many beer sections, and you will see cans and bottles covered in aggressive imagery that hints at strength and attitude. The whole presentation says, this is not a gentle crowd pleaser. It is for people who supposedly get big hops and bold bitterness. A lot of early craft drinkers cut their teeth on this kind of beer and still reach for it out of habit, because it feels like a shortcut to something bold without having to gamble on an unfamiliar label. The promise here is that but you are grabbing pure, uncompromising West Coast intensity from a company that stood up to the big guys. The reality is that Stone Brewing, after years of positioning itself as a defender against macro beer, eventually sold to a large Japanese brewing conglomerate. Receipt 1 is the acquisition announcement itself, framed as a path to stability, growth, and future investment. Receipt 2 is the scale signal you can see without reading any press at all: wide chain placement, broad national reach, and the kind of supply consistency that typically comes from large systems, not a small, local operation that can only brew what it can personally control. Where this becomes a must-avoid buying blind issue is not the existence of ownership change by itself. It is the mismatch between the story the label sells and the variables the shopper is exposed to in the real world. When a hop-forward beer travels long distances, sits in warehouses, gets stocked in back rooms, and then lands under bright lights, the beer can lose what made it exciting. That does not mean something is wrong with it. It means time and temperature quietly sand the edges off. People who drink this brand regularly often describe a noticeable difference between a fresh pour at a brewery setting and a random can pulled from a warm shelf. Some say it still hits the same. Others say certain batches feel flatter, less aromatic, or less sharp than the memory. That split reaction is exactly what makes it risky. The shopper has no idea which version they are about to get until the tab is pulled. There is also a psychological factor that keeps it selling even when it underperforms. The branding is confident, almost confrontational, and that can make people blame their own palate first. They assume they got a weird can, or that their food pairing was off, or that their taste changed. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes the simplest explanation is that a big, widely distributed hop-forward beer is at the mercy of storage conditions that vary wildly from store to store. Buy it cold, and treat the date like the real label. If you cannot find a packaged on or Best By marker you trust, skip the hop-forward gamble and reach for a style that can handle time and temperature better, because the most expensive disappointments usually come from brands that look like guaranteed premium picks, right up until the business story turns them into an asset instead of a beer. And you can probably feel the pattern forming now. The bigger the story on the can, the more it matters what is happening behind the scenes and on that shelf. If this is useful, hit like so more shoppers actually see it before they waste money. And subscribe, because I break these down with labels, ownership shifts, and the boring details that usually get ignored. Now I want one thing from you. What is the California beer brand you stopped trusting? And what exactly happened the last time you bought it? Was it the flavor, the freshness, the price, or just that it felt different than you remembered? Drop the brand and the store type you bought it from in the comments. Next, we are getting into the brand that went from can't miss to wait, what happened? Number 5, Ballast Point Brewing Company. In many aisles, there is a label decorated with fish and nautical themes that once felt like the crown jewel of West Coast India Pale Ale culture. For a while, that flagship beer was the thing everyone told their friends to try, a kind of unofficial benchmark for juicy, hoppy, sunshine in a glass flavor. For a lot of drinkers, grabbing this brand used to feel like joining a club. The promise was premium craft with a sharp identity and a price to match. The reality is that Ballast Point Brewing Company went through one of the most talked about sales arcs in beer, purchased for a massive headline price by a major beverage company, and later sold again for far less. Receipt 1 is that widely reported top-of-market deal, which turned a brewery into a portfolio trophy. Receipt 2 is the later exit, which signaled how hard it can be to maintain the original value proposition once a brand becomes an asset to buy and sell. In the real world, that often shows up as inconsistency and confusion. Some stores still price the beer like it is the Glory Days version, even while some fans say the quality has felt uneven over time, especially outside the freshest channels. That is a consumer pattern, not a legal conclusion, and it matters because you are the one paying premium prices. If the price is premium, ask the cooler a few questions first. Is it cold right now, or has it been sitting warm? Does the store actually move beer, or does this section look like it forgets things? If you still want it, the safest version is the one poured fresh where kegs turn fast, or the one grabbed from a shop that keeps everything cold and moving, because there's a specific kind of brand stress you can't hide with clean packaging. The moment everywhere becomes the goal, and consistency becomes the cost. Number 4, Modern Times Beer. For a while, this brand felt like the future of cool beer culture. Minimalist art, creative names, and a mix of coffee, stout, and hoppy releases that made social media light up. Fans drove across town for special cans, and the company leaned hard into the idea of being more than just a brewery, almost a lifestyle. On shelves, it still looks modern, clean, and confident. The promise is that you are buying into a thoughtful, quality-first operation that obsesses over both flavor and aesthetics. The reality is that Modern Times Beer expanded fast, opened multiple locations, and ultimately ended up in financial trouble that forced sales, closures, and restructuring. Receipt 1 is the wave of public announcements about shutting down tap rooms and reorganizing the business to stay alive. Receipt 2 is the ownership shift, away from the original structure, including asset sales that changed who controls decisions and how the brand's priorities get set. For you in the grocery aisle, that can translate into a strange mismatch. The label promises a perfectly tuned experience, while your actual can might not match the hype, especially if it has traveled far or sat for a while. Some drinkers talk about certain releases feeling hit or miss, depending on when and where they buy them. That is exactly the kind of pattern that makes something risky to buy blind. Another action tip: if you are curious, seek out the freshest releases at dedicated shops or tap rooms, but be cautious about betting on older shelf-worn cans just because the branding looks sharp. Because the next one digs into what happens when a respected name stretches too thin and the core product starts to feel different from what built the reputation. Number 3, Green Flash Brewing Company. There was a time when fans spoke about a certain West Coast India Pale Ale from this company almost in hushed tones. It was bitter, bright, and felt like a secret handshake among people who loved hop-heavy beers. Shelves carrying this label once signaled that a store cared about the cutting edge of the craft scene. Because not every shop bothered to stock something that intense. Even people who did not love bitterness respected it, because it tasted like a confident statement instead of a compromise. The promise was that you were getting a laser-focused, quality-driven product from a brewer obsessed with pushing flavor. The reality is that Green Flash Brewing Company expanded hard, built a large production footprint, and then ran into serious financial problems that forced pullbacks, closures, and restructuring. Receipt 1 is the publicly discussed operational distress. Changes in markets served, changes in what locations stayed open, and changes in how widely the beer continued to flow. That kind of turbulence does not automatically ruin a beer, but it does change how predictable it is for the buyer who only sees a bottle on a shelf. Receipt 2 is the long-running consumer pattern that matters most in a grocery setting. People repeatedly reporting bottles that taste muted, flat, or simply not like the benchmark they remember, especially when purchased far from the home base, and especially when storage conditions are unknown. That is not proof of sabotage or secret recipe changes. It is the normal kind of inconsistency that shows up when a brand's distribution footprint shifts, and the beer spends more time at the mercy of warehouses, trucks, and warm retail shelves. For shoppers, that creates a split. On one hand, the name still carries emotional weight, and nostalgia is powerful. On the other hand, the experience in your glass can be unpredictable because distribution changes, financial stress, and inventory management tend to ripple into freshness, batch variation, and how aggressively older product gets pushed onto shelves. Don't assume every bottle with this label tastes like the legendary batches people remember. If you choose it, make sure it's from a shop that stores beer cold and moves inventory quickly. If there's no freshness marker or you can't verify it, just walk away, because some brands hold more than just their current flavor on the shelf. They carry the weight of history, and when that history becomes a burden, the cracks show. Number 2, Anchor Brewing. When people talk about the roots of modern American craft beer, this name almost always comes up. The imagery is old school, the story goes back more than a century, and the association with that San Francisco steam-style beer is deep. For many drinkers, grabbing this label feels like participating in history, not just buying a beverage. It is the kind of brand people recommend to visitors because it feels like a piece of the state. The promise is comfort, tradition, and a sense that some things are too iconic to really change. The reality is that Anchor Brewing has been through major turbulence, including ownership changes, attempts at repositioning, and a full shutdown announcement that shocked fans and retailers. Receipt 1 is that public closure moment, which confirmed production was stopping and distribution was being wound down. When production stops, the shelf becomes a time capsule, and time is not kind to beer. Receipt 2 is the revival fog that followed. Acquisition news and talk of bringing the brand back. Even when the intentions are good, that kind of transition creates a confusing shelf reality for shoppers. What is old stock that has been sitting? What is newly produced produced, if anything has returned yet, which stores are rotating inventory responsibly, and which ones are letting iconic labels linger because the label still sells itself. In the real world, that means you can walk into some stores and still see bottles hanging around purely because the brand is famous. The issue is not that the beer suddenly became unsafe. It is that age, uncertain storage, and unclear timelines can turn an iconic name into a flat, stale experience in the glass. And because the label is legendary, people often blame themselves first instead of the simplest variable, time. Be extremely cautious if you see this sitting on a neglected shelf or in a store that looks like it is not rotating older inventory. If you want the story to taste the way it should, wait until you are confident fresh batches are truly flowing again, not just lingering labels. Because there is one more pattern that hits even harder than nostalgia. When a polished craft identity stays loud, the pricing stays premium, and the actual experience starts depending more on shelf life and distribution than on what the brand promises. Number 1, Firestone Walker Brewing Company. In many stores, this name shows up across multiple styles: pale ales, India pale ales, lagers, and special releases in fancy boxes. The branding feels polished and confident, with references to barrels, heritage, and that California mix of wine country seriousness and beach town ease. Even if you are not a beer nerd, the shelf presentation nudges you toward the same assumption. This is the smart pick, the one you bring to a dinner or a weekend trip when you want to look like you know what you are doing. The promise is that every bottle and can from Firestone Walker Brewing Company is a carefully crafted, high-end experience worth a little extra money. The reality is more nuanced, and that nuance is exactly why it lands at number 1 for avoid buying blind. This brewery is majority owned by an international, family-owned Belgian company. That is not automatically a negative, but it changes the story from purely local to part of a broader portfolio that has different goals than a tiny independent operation. Receipt 1 is that ownership structure itself, which is openly discussed and helps explain why the brand maintains wide reach, consistent shelf presence, and a very controlled premium image. Receipt 2 is visible right in the cooler. The range is huge. You have year-round core beers pushed hard in grocery channels, sitting next to seasonal releases and specialty products that move at very different speeds. That creates a quiet quality gap that is not about good versus bad, but about what the shopper is really paying for. A beer that sells fast and stays cold can taste excellent. The same brand's box release that sits under bright lights for months can feel like you paid for packaging and reputation more than the best version of the beer. For you, that can mean paying top-tier prices for something that might have lost some of its edge by the time it reaches your fridge, especially if it is a hop-forward style lingering on a warm shelf. Some drinkers swear the core lineup remains excellent when fresh. Others say the experience feels noticeably less special when the beer has clearly been around for a while, and that disappointment hits harder when the label signals premium so loudly. The brand is not the only one where freshness matters, but the premium positioning turns shelf conditions into a bigger part of what you are actually buying. If you are going to spend extra here, treat it like ordering off a large restaurant menu. Do not assume everything is equally safe just because the name is respected. Pick styles that survive time better. Buy from stores that keep beer cold, and look for clear freshness markers when you can. Because the final lesson in this whole list is not that good brands cannot make disappointing beer, it is that the shelf decides more than the label wants you to believe. You just watched 8 different stories point to the same buyer problem. In the grocery aisle, you are not only buying beer, you are buying storage conditions, shelf time, and a brand narrative that may or may not match the reality behind it. The fix is not paranoia, it is a faster filter. Check the date when you can, buy hop-forward beer cold, and do not pay a craft premium unless you are comfortable with what the label actually represents. Now, I want to hear from you. Which California beer did you stop trusting, and what was the exact moment it flipped for you? A dull batch, a price jump, or that "this feels different" feeling? Drop the brand and the store type in the comments. And if this saved you even one disappointing purchase, hit like and subscribe. The next upload is a quick grocery cooler test that helps you spot old beer in seconds.